One time, Jack and his mom and his brothers, Tom and Will, was living way off up in the mountains outside of town. They tried to raise their own food and also did a little bit of fishing and hunting just to put a little meat on the table. There wasn't many real close neighbors around, but about 2 miles from where they lived a miller who always ground the corn for them. The miller was an old man who lived up in the loft of his mill, and he was known far and wide as a braggart and a trickster. Not only did the miller actually pull a lot of trickery on people, his favorite pastime was bragging about it and telling about how smart he was and about all the tricks he'd played. Why, I could steal the bed sheets off of a bed while you are asleeping and you'd never know it. I could steal the food off your fork while it was between your plate and your mouth. I could steal anything right under your nose. And this was all the old man would talk about. Now, people around knew what the miller said was partly true. He was a trickster. And part of the proof was that while he was past 60, he had a wife who was only 16 and a new baby less than a year old. And everybody thought that that was a good trick right in itself for an old man as old as he was. But still, people did get awful tired of having to listen to him brag all the time. Old man, some of the neighbors would say, one of these days somebody is going to steal something from you. Then you'll be sorry that you done all this bragging. That will never happen, the miller vowed and declared. Nobody will ever steal anything from me. Why, if anybody was to ever steal just one thing off me, or if anybody could just come and do business at the mill without me stealing from them while they're here, well, I'd give them this mill and everything in it. When what the miller had said got spread around the community, everybody living around there took it as a challenge to try to make a fool out of him. But it seemed that the harder people tried, the more the miller was able to steal from them. They were off their guard when they were trying to pull something on him. And it wasn't long until everybody around there had tried and failed and given up. And the only people who hadn't given it a try were Tom, Will, and Jack. They had talked about it often enough, but every time they were working on a plan, somebody else would try it and would fail. And Jack kept saying that it wasn't just worth wasting your time to try. He said that they just ought to give up going about their business. Then one day, Tom came up with a new idea. Let's go at him, 2-on-1, he said. Let's go up there and get some corn ground, and while one of us watches the corn go in the top of the mill, the other one can watch the cornmeal come out the bottom. That way, he can't possibly steal anything from us, and maybe one of us can pick up something of his while he's not a-looking. Well, that's a good plan, Will said. I'll go for it with ye. Jack shook his head. You two go on. I just don't want anything to do with that old man. He's too slick for us. And so Tom and Will got ready. They shelled out a bunch of corn, sacked it up, and both of them rode double bareback on their daddy's horse down to the miller's. Once there, they tied the horse to a tree in the yard. Then they carried a sack of corn inside to get on with their plan. The miller took the sack of corn, and Tom stationed himself at the bottom of the chute and held an empty sack to catch the ground cornmeal. Now he was going to watch and see that the miller didn't steal even a grain of his cornmeal. Will, he followed the miller up to the hopper where he poured the corn in the top of the mill to be ground. And he was making sure that not a single grain of corn ended up in the miller's pocket. The miller opened up the water gate to start the mill to grinding, while Tom and Will had their eyes glued to what they thought was happening. The miller noticed how hard Tom and Will were concentrating on the corn grinding, and he knew that they couldn't be paying attention to anything else while this was going on. So he slowed down the water so the mill would take a lot longer to grind the corn, then slipped out the door into the yard and left Tom and Will watching inside. Once in the yard, the miller noticed that the horse tied to the tree. He walked over and asked out loud, "Does this horse belong to anybody around here?" Of course Tom and Will couldn't hear him from the inside of the running mill. The miller then said, "All right, since nobody claims this horse, I guess it must belong to me." He untied the horse and put it in the barn up above the mill. When the miller got back to the mill, the corn was just finishing up, and the last grains of meal were falling into Tom's sack. Tom, he tied the sack up tight, and then he said to the miller, "Well, we did it. We ground a whole half bushel of corn, and you didn't even steal even one grain from us." "You boys sure are smart, all right," the miller smiled at him. "Go on home, and this afternoon I'll bring you the deed to the mill." Tom and Will, they laughed out loud to one another as they went out the door of the mill. Then they looked up and saw that the daddy's horse was gone. "Have you seen our horse?" Will asked the miller. The miller said, "Well, I have a new horse that somebody left out here for me. I asked all around to see whether it belonged to anybody, but nobody spoke up. And since it was a trespassing on my land, I took it that it was meant for me." With that, Tom and Will found out that they hadn't won after all, and they had to walk all the way home, carrying their own cornmeal, and tell their mom and Jack what had happened to their horse. Jack said, "I told you not to mess with him. The harder you try, the trickier he gets. I am not going to mess with that old man at all." A few weeks after that, Jack decided he'd go off a-hunting for the day. He got his daddy's old muzzle-loading gun, a powder horn, and some homemade bullets, and then he started off out in the woods. He didn't have much luck at all close to home that day, so he walked farther and further, determined to find something to shoot for supper. But by late afternoon, Jack had still not had any luck, so he started out walking toward home. Now it was completely dark long before Jack got even halfway home, and he knew from the kind of night it was that he was sure to have a terrible time finding his way home. It was pitch dark, and so cloudy that you couldn't even see a star in the sky. There wasn't any moon, and of course, way out there in the country, there wasn't any kind of lights to be seen. And it hadn't even occurred to Jack that he might have needed to carry a lantern with him on a hunting trip like that. Now Jack, he was a-tripping over roots and rocks, and was running smack dab into trees. He was a-stumbling into creeks. It was so dark out there that Jack had to reach up with his fingers sometimes just to see if his eyes were shut or closed. All of a sudden, Jack ran smack into the side of a building. He felt his way along the wall in the dark, and when he came to the mill, he realized he had stumbled into the mill where the tricky miller lived, with his wife and his young'un. Maybe, Jack thought, maybe the miller will let me spend the night here, and then I can go on home tomorrow. So Jack felt his way back around the mill until he come to the door. There he knocked and waited to see if anyone was inside. Nobody come to the door, and Jack realized that there was no light burning in the house, and that maybe nobody was at home. He knocked one more time and heard somebody stirring around way inside. And finally the door opened, and there he saw the miller standing in the dark. He was wearing his nightshirt, and it looked to Jack like he'd been asleep for some time. "Why, Jack," the miller said, "what are you doing knocking around here so late at night? Don't you know that I have a young wife that needs to get into bed early?" "Well, it ain't that late," Jack said. "Well, I bet it's past 8 o'clock. It's just so dark this time of year that you think it's late." "Well, anyway, Jack, what can I do for you?" "Well, I got stuck out here and it got dark on me, and I wonder if you might have space for me to spend the night. Then I could go on home tomorrow." "Why, sure, Jack," the miller said. "We've got plenty of beds. You know that the miller who lived here before I came had a big old family, and he left a house full of beds. Come on in, there's plenty of room." Jack started to step in the door, and then the miller said, "Wait a minute, Jack. You better go visit the outhouse before we go in. I don't keep any bed pots in the house, and you might need to go before morning." So Jack went to the outhouse, and then he followed the miller on into the mill. It was so dark that the miller lit a candle to see the way, and they went up the stairs to the loft, following the light of the one candle. Once in the loft, Jack looked around the big room. There was a fireplace at one end, but since it was still a warm night, the fire had all burned out, and there were 6 big double beds arranged around the walls of the room. In one of them, the miller's wife was sound asleep, her baby sleeping in a cradle on the floor beside her. The miller turned to Jack and said, "Take your pick, Jack. Any bed you want is yours. My wife and I sleep in all of them at one time or another. We usually sleep in one until it gets dirty, and then we move on to the next. That way it takes about a year before they all get dirty enough for us to have to wash all the sheets at once." Well, Jack, he picked out a bed on the opposite wall, as far as he could get from the miller and his wife. He undressed and crawled into bed, while the miller blew out the candle and crawled into his own bed. But Jack was almost asleep when he suddenly had an idea. "Sure is dark," he thought, "and it sure is early. And with no pots under any of the beds, I'll bet that miller and his wife will never make it through the night without having to go to the bathroom. I think I'll just stay awake right here for a while and see what happens." Jack propped himself up into the dark. He couldn't see a thing, but he could hear every move it made in that room, even the sound of breathing as the miller and his wife and that baby were asleep. And it wasn't actually very long until Jack heard a sound of breathing change, and then he heard the covers rustle across the room. And then he heard the sound of a pair of little feet on the floor. And he could hear that the miller's wife felt her way around the room until she found the top of the stairs. He could hear her whisper to herself about how dark it was. And he could hear her make her way down the stairs. And he could hear the mill door close as she went out for a late night visit to the outhouse. As soon as he was sure she was outside, Jack slipped out of his bed, eased over to the bed where the miller was asleep, picked up the cradle with the sleeping baby in it, carried it across the room. He put the baby cradle back down right beside his bed. Once back in bed, Jack started listening again. He heard the downstairs door open and shut as the miller's wife put her way back inside the darkened mill. Jack heard her feeling her way slowly back up the stairs to the loft. When she got to the top of the stairs, he heard her talking out loud to herself about how dark it was. "Now, where's my bed?" she said. "It's so dark in here that you can't see the end of your nose." She felt her way around the room to where she thought her bed was, but then she felt to see whether her baby was covered up, and the cradle wasn't there. "I must be turned around," she said to herself. "We keep switching beds so much that I can't remember where I was sleeping." And Jack listened as she felt her way around the room, feeling from bed to bed, trying to find the one where the baby cradle was sitting. When she found it, she was standing right beside Jack. She covered the baby back up, give the cradle a little rock, and thinking she had now come to the right bed, climbed right up into the bed with old Jack. Nobody knows if or when she found out if she was in the wrong bed, but whether or not she did, she stayed right there for the rest of the night. And Jack, he slept pretty late into the next morning. After all, he had stayed up later than he usually did. When he opened his eyes at last, the first thing he saw was a miller sitting at the table writing on a sheet of paper. The old miller had already signed the mill over to Jack, and he was writing out the deed to turn the rest of what he'd owned into Jack's name. "Jack," the miller said, "you've done it. You're the first person in the world to ever steal anything from me, and I keep my word you win." So Jack moved right into the mill now that it was his. The miller did get to keep his wife and baby, even though Jack could have said that they were part of the deal too. Now people say that Jack ran that mill for a good long time before he gave it over to his brothers, so he could go out on the road again to try to seek his own fortune.